Hi everyone, welcome to the October 18th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, back with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski. I'm grateful to both guests that filled in last week, Marcus Hirsch on Tuesday and Scott Carson later in the week to do some handicapping with me, but very happy to have Craig back in the co-host seat. And Craig, welcome back from your week off and a belated happy anniversary to you and Elsie.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, we had a great time. Got away for a few days. 30 years. It was fun times as always when I travel with Elsie. So things went well. I did try to keep up on the racing and what I did miss while I was away. I mean, I was back by the weekend, so I saw a lot of it. And there was some surprisingly pretty good racing, in my opinion. Usually this kind of a slow time, but we did see a couple of decent efforts.
Yeah, usually this is a time when the racing world takes a little bit of a pause as we wait for the Breeders' Cup to happen. Most of the prep racing is done by now, as we are just under 3 weeks away from that Breeders' Cup weekend in early November. So not too many graded stakes on the calendar. Most of those that did take place were at Keeneland, and that's where we're going to focus most of this show, even beyond the stakes action. There were some noteworthy performances that I think are worth discussing from Keeneland last week, particularly among the 2-year-olds. And Craig, this is a time of year when we start to see some well-bred 2-year-olds come out of the woodwork, some that weren't quite ready to make races like the Breeders' Cup, but could be factors in the run-up to the Kentucky Oaks and Kentucky Derby next year.
We see that often. Just because we haven't seen a horse by now doesn't really mean they're not extremely talented and could go on to be top 3-year-olds. You see it all the time, especially 2-year-olds. They develop at different races. They get ready. They're prepared differently. So I do think we saw some nice performances.
Well, we're going to visit a few venues as we recap last week's racing, but the bulk of this show will take place at Keeneland. Let's begin there with their Grade 1 feature from last Saturday, the Queen Elizabeth II Challenge Cup, this one for the 3-year-old fillies on the turf. And Craig, I wouldn't say this was the deepest field that we've ever seen assembled in this race. It came up on the weaker side. Chad Brown obviously had a very strong hand coming in, sending out that heavy favorite McCulloch, but it was the other Chad that got the job done here, Gina Romantica, a horse that I know both you and I had been impressed with last time when she was arguably best, finishing second in that Pebble Stakes at Aqueduct, and she took a step forward here, stepping up against Graded Stakes Company.
Right. I know neither one of us are big on tooting our horns, but I think we did a really good job talking about Gina Romantica last time when she lost to Faith in Humanity. That one had reversed the decision from her the prior time. And we talked about how they were just the one with the better pace setup won. And from my perspective, what was interesting was they were running just as fast as some of the top graded stakes that we're seeing. So I know we both like Gina Romantica in this spot, and I just thought she ran an excellent race. No real excuses for McCulloch. She actually ran her best TimeformUS speed figure of 118, but it wasn't good enough to catch Gina Romantica, who also ran a career best at 121.
Yeah, as I'm sure you know, I've become a fan of this filly. I was on her when she made that turf debut in the risk-averse and won at 14-1, and she's just a horse that has completely turned her career around since finally getting on the turf. It's kind of funny that a trainer like Chad Brown took so long to get one that's this well-bred onto the turf, but it really is more of a dirt pedigree, being Buy-In to Mischief, half-sister to, I believe, Stone-tastic, that very good dirt sprinter from a number of years ago. But she's really come alive with the switch to the turf. It's now 3 starts, arguably has been best in all of those, certainly best in this Queen Elizabeth from last Saturday, but Flavien Prat did give her a perfect ride, saving ground every step of the way, splitting horses in upper stretch. Credit to the horse, because she did have the turn of foot to go through that hole, but Flavien Prat just made all the right moves on her.
He did, and he used her good tactical speed. I would argue she probably has better tactical speed than McCulloch and was able to take full advantage, save ground. And as you said, it's not easy. Not all horses will just willingly go through that gap like she did. So she's obviously one that can do it. And just this turned out to be a pretty strong race. It didn't look that strong on paper coming in other than the 2 Chad Browns, but it's not like the others were miles behind. I thought it turned out pretty good.
Yeah, Bella Bell ran pretty well coming in from California. McCulloch, I think, ran her race. We had just talked about it a little bit. Those turf triple series races in New York, sometimes they don't come up that tough after they run the Belmont Oaks and Derby. The second and third legs of that series can be a little bit on the weak side, and I think she had faced some softish fields in the last couple of starts, so it wasn't a big surprise to me that she was beaten here as the 4-5 favorite. I'd imagine this speed figure was a little tough to make because there was another turf route early in the day that I assume you could not compare this to because they just featured such wildly different pace situations. We're not going to talk about that one in depth. It was won by Kentucky Ghost, but that was a race that just completely fell apart, whereas this QE2 had much less pace going on and featured some faster closing fractions.
I honestly don't remember. I'll look that up at some point during the show and get back to it. I don't remember if it was tough or not, to be honest. I know this race itself fit pretty tight.
Yeah, of that race, it got a 1:25 final time figure. We gave it the pace, not just the pace downgrade, but the pace breakout, because the number just came up a little bit too fast. Didn't really make sense for some horses in the field. So I understand why you did what you did, and you gave the QE2 the higher speed figure, despite it having a slower final time, just different pace situations.
Right, and I looked it up while you were talking. There were actually two other turf routes on the card as well, for 2-year-olds, so not ideal, but it made it kind of fit with those two.
Let's talk about the other graded stakes from Keeneland last week. It was run a day earlier on Friday. That was the Grade 3 Sycamore. This one going 1.5 miles for the older runners. I guess a possible prep for the Breeders' Cup Turf. We might see the winner of this race back in there. I guess it has to be decided what they want to do. But Highland Chief, Craig, kind of validated his Grade 1 upset in the Man of War from earlier in the year. This older turf marathon division, especially among the male horses, has been kind of all over the place. Horses taking turns winning these races. So nice to see Highland Chief achieve a second victory in Graded Stakes Company this year.
It was a good effort, and you praised the ride from Favi and Pratt earlier. I think we have to praise the ride from John Velasquez in this race because he just did everything right. He used the horse's tactical speed. He saved ground, was able to get a clear trip, and in a race that featured just a lot of very evenly matched horses, in my opinion, I think the trip made all the difference. He wound up with a 121 TimeformUS speed figure, which is right around what he always runs, and I would say John Velasquez just maximized that with the ride he gave.
I completely agree. Highland Chief got the job done here. I think it's debatable whether or not he was the best horse in this race because 8 horses crossed the wire within a length and a half of each other. Actually, the horse who finished 8th, Red Knight, was just a half length officially out of second place. That's how close these horses were at the wire. So trips were of just utmost importance in this race. And as you said, John Velasquez just always had Highland Chief in the best spot, saving ground, was able to slip through inside without any trouble, whereas others had to go wide on the turns, had traffic trouble. A couple horses that I'll mention in particular that had some trouble in this race were Arklow, who was just covered up in traffic for most of the stretch run, though Arklow seems to be the kind of horse that does find trouble at certain points. And also Balthus, a horse who was an up-and-coming sort for Chad Brown, finished 5th, but a horse who arguably should have been 2nd, but he was just covered up in traffic for most of the stretch run as well. So the results could have been different if the trips had worked out in a separate manner. This might be a race that I actually do on my horses to watch, which I'll record tomorrow because there's so much to discuss from a trip standpoint.
And I did want to mention Mirror Mission as well. That running line looks a little disappointing, but I think he had a bit of an excuse as well, as he was just wide the whole way around the course. He had run better figures coming in, and 2 out of his last 3 just didn't show it. But I'm going to give him a little bit of an excuse as well.
Sentimentally, I was hoping that we would see a return to form for Channel Maker in this race. And he actually ran pretty well to be 4th in here, just a neck and a nose out of 2nd place. But I'm not sure it's going to be quite enough for him to make his 6th appearance in the Breeders' Cup. I think that would be a record if he got into the Breeders' Cup turf, but it just seems like he might not quite be in that form anymore.
No, I agree. And he ran about as good as he's capable of these days. He generally needs to be on the lead or get a trip like he did in this case where he was tracking in 2nd but out in the clear. And I thought he ran about as good as he could. It would be a cool story, I guess, if he ran, but I don't think he'd be any kind of contender.
Well, Craig, that's all the stakes action from Keeneland last week, but we should talk about many of the maiden and allowance races that they ran because there were a few that achieved notable speed figures and featured some horses that I think we're going to hear from in Stakes Company in the very near future. Let's go back to a maiden race from Thursday's card for the 2-year-olds. This one was at 7 furlongs on the Beard course, and a horse that caught a lot of people's attention, and rightly so, was Extra Anejo, the debuter for trainer Steve Asmussen. This horse cost $1.35 million as a yearling, and he looks worth every bit of that based on this debut performance.
He did. When I sat down to make the speed figures on Friday, one kind of jumped out. As I've mentioned before, I don't have the names or the connections or anything like that on our worksheet, and I was like, whoa, that's a big figure for a 2-year-old. And it turned out it was really big, a 119 for him. I guess it makes sense when you see the connections and you see the breeding that he has. He's certainly bred very, very well, which explains that sales price. And I mean, this figure puts him up right up there with every 2-year-old out there, except maybe Cave Rock, who we saw from Bob Baffert. And even him, it's not very far off. And this was his first start.
Yeah, and I think this horse got a higher speed figure than Cave Rock ran in his career debut. I think that one got, I want to say a 118 maybe, or maybe slightly lower than that. So Extra Anejo, I mean, rare that you see a 2-year-old debut with a speed figure that's near 120. That's extremely special. And this horse, I mean, the number checks out because you look behind him and there are just huge gaps between the horses. I mean, obviously he won by 9.5 lengths. The runner-up was second by nearly 7 lengths back to the third horse. Much bigger gaps as you go through the field. So it totally checks out that he ran a number that was this fast. And visually, this horse was so impressive. I mean, obviously he was heavily touted to be 7-5, but he ran the professional race, broke on top, just showed easy speed to get to the front, drew away without being asked on the far turn, and basically Tyler Gaffalione was like a statue in the stirrups for the entire stretch drive. And this horse, though he's a son of Into Mischief, I wouldn't say that physically he looks like all of the Into Mischiefs. He's kind of this, burlier sort. It looks like he carries a lot of weight to him. It seems like one that's not going to have a whole lot of trouble stretching out in distance. So definitely an intriguing horse for the Steve Asmussen barn.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how it looked because I actually haven't watched this race, so I'm glad that you chimed in with that. And yeah, just it is one I definitely need to make a point to go back and see, because the impressive thing for me too is he did it at that extended 7 furlong distance. You mentioned the Beard course. It's actually more than 7.25 furlongs. So don't be fooled by that about 7 furlongs. It's not 7 furlongs and a few feet. You're almost getting into 7.5 furlong range.
Yeah, and I will just add some things about this horse's pedigree because it's really interesting. Though he's got that precocious sire Into Mischief on the top side, it's actually a lot of European breeding on the bottom side of his pedigree. The dam is by Hardspun, but she herself ran in Europe, was a winner going 1.25 miles on the all-weather surface in Europe. And then if you go deeper into the family, this is the family of horses like Islington, who won the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf, Greek Dance, who was, I think, 1.5 mile Group 1 winner in Germany. There's a lot of turf stamina breeding on the bottom side of this pedigree, so really interesting pairing there with that speed from Into Mischief on the top. And this horse just seems to have all the ingredients to be a top 3-year-old next year. It's going to be interesting to see how he develops. Another performance that turned a lot of heads at Keeneland last week was on Friday, an allowance victory by the Brad Cox-trained Strobe. This horse was very impressive when he won his debut race on Derby weekend, I believe actually on Derby Day after the Kentucky Derby, and we hadn't seen him since then. Didn't make his second start until this past Friday at Keeneland, and Craig definitely won it easily, though did regress a little bit on the speed figure scale. I wonder how much that really matters, though, given how wrapped up he was at the end of this race.
Right, and he drew the outside post, or very near the outside, and broke sharp, was able to get to the rail pretty quickly, and just had everything his own way the whole way around. The pace was a bit on the slow side. That could have held the speed figure down a little. His final time figure was a 110, the overall just a 105. So 113 in debut. I'm not going to judge him off of this 105 figure. I would expect he's got even above that 113 we saw last time, particularly given he's going to have a race under his belt after that layoff.
Yeah, and I would imagine that you're always reluctant to do pace breakouts for dirt sprints because typically in these sprint races, especially on the dirt, horses generally run as fast as they're able to run. But looking through the field, it just feels like everybody in this race is earning a speed figure that's 10 to 12 points lower than what you might expect. Would you ever consider a pace breakout in a race like this, or you're just kind of reluctant to do it with horses that are in these dirt sprints?
Sure, I definitely would, and I've done it plenty of times, not as often as in some other races. This one was a really close call. Now that I have the chart in front of me, it may be one that I have to go back and revisit.
Yeah, this horse, regardless of the fig he got, 105 on this day and a 113 on debut, he's obviously pretty talented, and he's got the pedigree. I mean, he's another son of Into Mischief. His dam is that Grade 1 winner for Godolphin Flashing. He's, of course, a Godolphin homebred, and just very clear watching both of his starts. They have not nearly gotten to the bottom of this horse, and I think it remains to be seen what kind of runner he can develop into. Obviously, it's not ideal having 5 months between his first 2 starts, I guess, unless you have the talent of a horse like Flightline, but hopefully we get to see Strobe pretty soon. Let's move on to another allowance race that was run on that same Friday card, Keeneland, and this is a speed figure didn't have to hold back on, Craig, because these horses just ran flat out fast, and a bit of an upset here as Tejano Twist got the job done. This horse, unlike Strobe, who's just made 2 starts so far as a 3-year-old, has been pretty busy, as this was the 18th start of his career, and it seems like he's just reaching his peak.
Yeah, what was interesting, this race was restricted to 3-year-olds, unlike the Strobe race, even though he is a 3-year-old. And yeah, he's a horse who showed a lot of promise early. I remember seeing him live when he ran second in the one of the turf race or one of the sprint races. I think it was a prep for the Springboard Mile here at Remington Park. But then he shipped to Keeneland and actually won an allowance race. Looked like he was one of the better 3-year-old sprinters. But he had just kind of tailed off a bit, wasn't really running well, and somehow found himself in a claimer for 80,000 and was claimed away by Chris Hartman. And Chris Hartman's a guy that does well with claims. He took a little time with him. He tried him on turf a couple times, didn't really work out, but it seems like he finally figured him out because he ran a 118 speed figure here, a career best by quite a bit, even from that early. I think he had run a 112 or something as a 2-year-old. So he's one that definitely has some ability, and maybe Chris Hartman has him back on track. And as you say, he certainly doesn't mind running as his 18th start as just a 3-year-old.
Yeah, a little bit surprising that the top 2 finishers here were so dominant. I mean, neither one took a whole lot of money. Tejano Twist was 7-1. Knocker Down, who was second, I believe, was the second biggest price in the race at 22-1. And they just flat out drew away from this field in the stretch as the heavy favorite Peaceful Water is just another horse that posted a big fig at Saratoga on that dirt course and has not been able to run back to it. That Saratoga dirt course is almost starting to play a little bit like Aqueduct in the winter, where sometimes you can't always rely on the figures horses achieve there, and Peaceful Water is just not quite the same here, though he was pressed a little bit in the early going. Tejano Twist, though, I mean, really impressive turn of foot coming off the far turn to put himself in contention, and he was just able to run down that runner-up, who did run a big race, and kind of interesting in this optional claiming race. Those were the only 2 that were in for the $125,000 tag, and not a surprise neither one was claimed. Let's move on to another race at the allowance level at Keeneland last week. Moving on to Sunday's card. They ran a couple of allowance races that we should talk about, one on the turf and another on the dirt. Turf Sprint a little bit earlier in the day was won by Coffee Maker, a horse that I had kind of forgotten about. We had last seen her in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf Sprint when she was a 2-year-old, and she ran pretty well to finish 3rd that day at a decent price. Off for nearly a year, comes back in another Turf Sprint, and it's like she hadn't missed a beat because she stepped up and beat a pretty good group of males here.
She did. Wesley Ward running against males for some reason. He tends to do things like that, but he obviously knew what he was doing. She actually ran a 114 speed figure, a career best. It was even knocked down a little bit because of a slower pace. 116 final time. And this race was even faster than the Grade 3 Franklin, a race that frankly wasn't fast enough that we're not even really going to discuss it much on this show. And I clearly think she would have won that race had she been in it.
Yeah, I actually was looking through the speed figures and I was going to send that in, and then I noticed this allowance race, and justifiably so, Coffee Maker got the bigger speed figure. Caravel, I mean, who won that Franklin, she's certainly not a bad horse, and not a big surprise that she achieved, another Grade 3 victory here. But that race, it just felt like nobody really stepped up. There was a late scratch of that likable mare for Michelle Lovell, whose name's escaping me now, Change of Control. So having her out of the race maybe reduced the quality a little bit, but I would take nothing away from Coffee Maker, who won that allowance race in faster time. She was visually impressive in doing so, and I'll be interested to see what we get from her likely next year. But not a big surprise that Wesley Ward has yet another talented turf sprinter in his barn. Another race from Sunday that achieved a noteworthy speed figure was an allowance race run a little bit later in the day on the dirt course. I believe this was another one that was 7 furlongs on that Beard course, and it was won by Run Classic, kind of similar to Coffee Maker, a horse that had made some noise early in his career, had run pretty well, I think, at the fairgrounds early in his 3-year-old season, was off for a very long time, came back last time. This was his second start back off the layoff, and took yet another step forward for trainer Brett Calhoun.
Right, he had run in the Louisiana Derby against Hot Rod Charlie, to tell you how long ago it was, and was only 10-1 in that race in what was a really strong field with Midnight Bourbon. Disappeared for what I guess had to be going on 2 years, so quite a while. Came back at Churchill, won from off the pace, ran a nice 107 speed figure that day. You had to figure he might have some room to improve off of that effort, given the long layoff, and improve he did to a 114 speed figure, and did it much more easily this time. Showed more early speed, was much closer to the pace, and blew him away in the lane. So I'm not sure what the plans are with this one. He is a run happy. He had gone long a couple times, the second and third starts of his career, but at the very least, he looks like a horse that has the ability to be a very good sprinter.
Yeah, I agree with that, and maybe a one-turn miler type of horse eventually, given the way he ran this race. He was drawing off with authority at the end to win by over 8 lengths. Probably not the strongest field you're ever going to see at this level. I mean, the other horse that took money in here was Hidden Scroll, who somehow is still running and taking money in races like this. He was not really a factor after showing speed. He dropped back at the quarter pole. So maybe once you took him out of the race, it got a little bit easier, and Run Classic arguably should have been an even shorter price. He did win at 2-1, paying $662. But very impressive winner, and I would imagine Stakes will be next on the horizon. Craig, this race did get a slight pace downgrade to a 114. I did notice when I was looking through the Formulator charts, Beyer speed figures actually had this as the fastest race anywhere in the country last week. I think it got a 105 Beyer. I'm not quite sure where the disparity is or how this race came up quite so fast. Some of the other dirt races I did notice were going 2 turns earlier in the day, so maybe there was some kind of breakout there. I don't know. But this horse was dominant no matter what the speed figure was.
Yeah, I'll have to give that a look. I really don't remember. I don't remember any trouble making the speed figures. I think it started with 4 routes on the day, but there were a couple sprints later. So, yeah, I'll give it a look and see. But it was impressive nonetheless.
Well, the only other race on this Sunday card at Keeneland that was run at that about 7 furlong distance over the Beard course was a 2-year-old filly maiden race a little bit earlier in the card. And this one got a lot of people talking on social media because Julia Shining evoked memories of her older full sister, Malathot, as she won her debut here. Mostly because of the way she did it. Clearly a horse that was not totally focused or dialed in for this debut. I mean, she was reacting badly to kickback on the backstretch, was very green, but still made this looping move to get the job done here. But I think when we watched this race in real time and saw the final time come up on the board in the fractions, you kind of figured it was going to get a low speed figure. I guess you can debate how much that really matters given the visual impression.
Yeah, these kind of races are tough. I didn't see this one live. I did go back and watch a replay because I got a bunch of texts saying you got to see this horse. But like you mentioned, the first thing I noticed was the horse. I mean, the time. And I was like, that doesn't seem all that fast to me. And, I went back and looked, and I don't think it was very fast. It's only getting an 81 speed figure. And it was also kind of a meltdown where nobody was really doing a lot of running from up on the front end. I mean, the top 2 early finished 3rd and 4th, but the exacta, both horses came from way back. I'm not sure how much was in behind in this maiden race. And it just kind of seems like a slow race. So personally, I don't want to get too carried away on it. I would have to see a lot more from her. I kind of got a vibe of what we saw from Justique in her first race. And not to compare the two and say this one won't improve, but she certainly disappointed her second start with a very similar resume.
Yeah, I guess the difference I would point out between Justique and Julia Shining is that Justique did not lack professionalism on debut. I mean, she lacked some early speed, but the way that she moved through the pack and handled traffic and ran by that field, I mean, it spoke of a horse that was pretty well schooled in the mornings and was ready to do her business in the afternoon. Julia Shining was not your typical Todd Pletcher first-time starter. I mean, she was so green on the backstretch. I mean, it looked like, I'm sure Pletcher has schooled her in behind other horses, but it certainly looked like she hadn't because, I mean, she just seemed like she didn't know what was coming back at her when all that kickback was being brought up into her face on the backstretch. So that's why she lost contact with the field early. She actually broke well and was with the field for the first few strides before, just reacting so badly to that situation. But getting out in the clear seemed to be the trick for her as she looped the field. But the runner-up is another one that did benefit from the pace and actually had some traffic trouble as Julia Shining was blowing by her at the top of the stretch. She did prick her ears when she made the front, so, I mean, maybe there was something left in the tank. And I guess the other thing I'll point out, Craig, if you're going to make that comparison to Malathaat, remember, Malathaat's debut didn't come back that fast either. I think she also debuted going 6.5 or 7 furlongs at Belmont Park, and it was a slow-paced race that didn't get much of a speed figure, and she obviously improved a great deal from there when they stretched her out in distance. And this does feel like another filly that's going to want to go much farther in future starts.
Yeah, Malathaat didn't run this slow. I think it was in the low 90s and did have a pace excuse, which Julia Shining didn't have. The one thing I would note, she certainly isn't bred to be a sprinter, so I would assume longer distances can only help her get faster, too.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And physically, she looks like one that wants no part of sprinting. She is just the picture of a horse that wants to go longer on the dirt. So I would imagine she'll improve moving forward, but she's going to have to improve quite a bit to, I think, be as good as what the hype machine is suggesting at the moment.
And one thing I can't remember if I mentioned her speed figure was an 81, but this is the other sprint that was on the card from that race we were talking about with Run Classic. So maybe if I'm off on that one, it's one I'll definitely give another look to.
Let's move on to another venue. There was one graded stakes that took place at Aqueduct last week. It was the Grade 2 Sands Point, a run on Saturday. This one also 43-year-old fillies going 1.1 miles, kind of like the Grade 1 QE2 at Keeneland. And Skims, the winner of this race, another horse who got a great trip, and actually a horse that was beaten by Gina Romantica a little bit earlier in the year. She was behind her in that risk-averse at Saratoga, but Skims has obviously come a long ways since then. She's significantly improved in her last couple of starts and was able to put it all together here at Aqueduct on Saturday.
Rich, she got a 118 speed figure for the win. Obviously this race was nowhere near as strong as the race at Keeneland, at least in my opinion. It didn't look so bad on paper, but just a weaker level. She ran fine. A 118 is good for a 3-year-old this time of year. I don't want to slate it too much. It wasn't the easiest speed figure to make. The course had some give on it. It didn't really match up with the 8.5 furlong race run a couple earlier, so I rated it in isolation. So it's a speed figure I'm going to be keeping an eye on.
Yeah, the top two, Skims and Vergara, they had previously battled at Kentucky Downs, and both had shown significant speed figure improvement that day, and they carried that over to Aqueduct as they obviously had the stamina to get this 1.1 miles here, whereas some others seem to be lacking their typical turns of foot or late kicks. Both the horses that took some money in this race, or actually I should say two of them, Eminent Victor, the one Chad Brown entrant in here, as well as Pizza Bianca, who did go off favored, they just couldn't really make inroads into Skims' advantage in the stretch. I mean, both were trying to come with their late runs, but there just wasn't a whole lot of closing going on in this race.
No, and this was a race I actually bet, and I was totally against Pizza Bianca, so I wasn't surprised. I wasn't smart enough to come up with a winner, but that one was a little bit suspect for me, so I wasn't surprised she ran back and forth.
Another race at Aqueduct from the past week that I want to discuss was a maiden race a little bit earlier on Friday, actually the first race of the day on that Friday card. And this was won by another 2-year-old that I think we could hear some things from as he, moves into his sophomore year. And that is Signator, a Shug McGahee trainee, West Point owned runner, cost $1.7 million as a 2-year-old in training earlier this year. And this horse did break his maiden in his second start going a mile, but feels like one that might want to go even farther than that down the line.
Right. This race was impressive. It only got a 96 speed figure for me, 101 on final time, knocked down because of a very, very slow pace. But he actually closed into this. I mean, I haven't checked the Trackus times, but he was flying at the end. His pace figure at the 6 furlong mark was just an 80. He finished that mile with a final time of 101. So you're not going to see that kind of improvement in 2 furlongs from a 2-year-old very often.
Yeah, I did look up the Trackus come home times for this race, and they had Signator coming home his last quarter in 23.58 seconds, his last eighth in 11.86. I mean, he was really moving across the wire here, and as you said, after being rated behind a slow pace, it's not like he was that far back because the entire field was bunched up, but I still think it's important to note when a 2-year-old can take kickback like that, sitting behind other horses, come through inside of horses, and still display that kind of turn of foot that he did. I was also impressed by this horse when he made his debut. He finished second, going just 6 furlongs that day, but the way that he finished up and galloped out said to me that added distance is going to be right up his alley. And Shug McGahee, the trainer, I mean, very familiar with this female family, as this is actually a runner that has Phipps breeding on the bottom side. The dam was a Phipps bred horse. Furlough is the second dam. She was a grade 1 winner for the Phippses. I think won the grade 1 ballerina. Could go longer also. So Signator strikes me as one that we're going to hear from in Stakes Company. I don't know if they're going to point him to a race like the Remsen. Maybe that's a little too soon. Maybe they want to try an easier spot before then, but I think he's going to get his chance in a Derby prep before too long. Move on to another 2-year-old race that I think is worth discussing from last week. Maybe not one of the faster ones, but a horse that should appreciate distance, and that is Tuskegee Airmen, a horse who won the listed Rocky Run Stakes at Delaware on Saturday. And kind of an interesting race to watch, Craig, because this horse just seemed to lack focus throughout. You could hear the surprise in the announcer's voice when he finally did make his run, because it just looked like he was going nowhere on the far turn, but once Paco Lopez got him into gear, his stamina came through.
Yeah, that was a good effort. As somebody who spent 23 years in the Air Force, I was really familiar with the Tuskegee Airmen. That was something that was taught to us in all of our study guides, and you had to know about him. So a cool horse that I'm always going to root for with that name. And yeah, this was a really good effort from him. He improved off that debut win. And like you said, I think the more distance, the better, given his breeding. And he's a talented horse for sure. He got a 97 on this day. And I definitely think there's more in the tank as the distances get longer.
Yeah, obviously you don't really know what he was beating in this minor stakes race at Delaware, but the way he finished up suggests that there could be more in the tank. He was coming back fairly quickly after winning his debut on Pennsylvania Derby Day at Parks. His trainer, John Service, I was reading in the post-race quotes, maybe downplaying that he might take a shot at the Remsen. That's the kind of race that I would figure a horse like this might target, but I think he was saying he was a little bit hard on himself with his, rear legs, maybe running down a little bit, so wants to give him some time before he gets back to the track after this race. So we'll see where he resurfaces. But this feels like another one that, while he hasn't run the fastest speed figures yet, he will appreciate added ground in the future. Let's move on to a race that got a much faster speed figure as we move on to another mid-Atlantic track. Laurel, actually on Thursday's card, they were off the turf this day, and this was an allowance race that was taken off the turf, won by American Doro, and might be a good thing for his connections because based on this form, he's more of a dirt horse than a turf horse.
If you look in the TimeformUS chart, you're going to see a 122. I've actually revised that. It's going to show up as a 119. But still a pretty darn good figure for a horse like him who spent most of his campaign on the turf. He had started out running okay on dirt. They switched him, and seems like maybe they just kept him there a little too long. It's possible maybe he just liked the slop and he's not going to love dirt on a dry fast track, but this was a pretty good effort. The figure did surprise me, but luckily for me, there was a sloppy track race run right before it for some pretty good allowance horses, and this horse ran significantly faster than them. So the figure seems pretty legit. I'm always a little skeptical of off the turf races, no matter what number comes back, because you just don't know what the competition was. But this seems like a good effort from American Dior.
Yeah, I also don't know what to make of this race. Like you said, we're always a little bit skeptical when, off the turf races produce the kinds of speed figures that suggest the top three might all be best on the dirt. When horses that are typically turf campaigners suddenly run new top numbers on the dirt, you kind of want to, cast a sidelong glance. But American Doro clearly ran a big race here. He won by over 9 lengths, was just relishing the sloppy track. Like you said, we don't know if he's just a wet track freak or not, but this horse clearly ran a lot better than he had in his prior turf races. I remember this horse had run at Aqueduct at one point last year, and I thought he was a little bit interesting, maybe kind of lacked that turf turn of foot, but just kind of has this big stride to him, this Son of American Pharaoh way of going that suggests, he would run all day, and maybe that stamina came through in this more demanding dirt surface. So definitely a horse that's going to be worth paying attention to when he runs back, you'd imagine, on the dirt again. Let's close things out on this podcast with another race that got a decent speed figure in allowance company, and we'll move down to Gulfstream to talk about this one, a Sunday allowance race going the 1.16 distance on their main track. And intriguing runner here, Craig O'Connor, who is a Chilean-bred horse, previously Chilean campaigned, a Group 1 winner in Chile, making his first start here in the U.S. for trainer Safi Joseph, and ran a nice race, was pretty visually impressive, and I think it remains to be seen what this horse's limits are.
Yeah, I certainly don't know. He was a horse who you kind of threw me when you sent Gulfstream. We don't talk about a lot of Gulfstream racing in this time of year. And it was a big effort. He wound up with what I'm going to guess. My assistant's doing the speed figure, but it looks pretty comfortable. Like it's going to be a 114, which first start in about 6 months is not bad at all. I imagine it took him some time to acclimate after shipping up from South America. And he obviously had a very good record there, particularly on dirt. He didn't run very well the 2 times he tried turf, but he's a horse who knows how to find the winner's circle, and a figure like that is going to fit into lower end, like listed in grade 3 stakes, and who knows, he could improve off that one effort.
Yeah, it seemed like he was just hitting his stride earlier this year in Chile. He won his Group 1 race, I think 2 starts before coming to the U.S., going 1.25 miles. He is a South American-bred 5-year-old, so he should be in the peak of his career right now. But visually impressive the way he made that move, basically the end of the backstretch. He moved very early in this race to take over. Did get a fast pace to close into, but the timing of his move suggested that he wasn't necessarily taking advantage of a race that fell apart. He just kind of made his own trip for himself. So clearly better than the competition that he faced here. And, I'm not really sure what was behind him. I mean, Sole Volante was just beaten barely out of second. And that's a horse that was once good as a 3-year-old, hasn't really been in that form for quite some time. So I'm not really sure where he stands from a class standpoint, but I'm sure they're going to try a tougher spot pretty soon. And I'll be interested to see if this horse is able to develop under Safi Joseph's care.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Sole Volante is not some graded stakes killer, but he's certainly a horse with some talent.
Well, Craig, that's all the racing to recap from this past week. Like we said, a bit of a quiet week in racing as we kind of wait for those Breeders' Cup cards to come out. I think pre-entries actually are released next week, so things are going to be moving pretty quickly with regard to that top-level racing. We'll, of course, look forward to that and do some content on the Breeders' Cup eventually. But before we get there, we'll do our usual forecast later this week. Craig, I imagine we'll probably take a look at that Keeneland card. It seems like these days Keeneland is churning out some of the best racing action going on, so I'm sure we'll take a look at that pick 5 sequence and see if it's worth discussing on the forecast later in the week.
Yeah, these next 2 weeks will probably be about as slow as it gets in horse racing, but there's always races being run that will allow you to bet on them, and we'll try to find some value for you.
That is for sure. Everybody, thanks for listening this week. Remember to catch these podcasts always on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Just subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel when you listen. Everybody, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up later in the week.